Well, kia ora. Thank you very much for that welcome. I'm Julie Douglas, and we practiced this morning, so let's see if it works. As the title slide up there suggests, we're going to be talking about the settlement that came about in 2017 in New Zealand for care workers, and our first phase of the research looking at some of the outcomes. So, what I thought we'd start with is a bit of a description of the sector, or the sectors that our subjects are working in. The settlement covers 3 different sectors: residential aged care, home and community care, and also the disability support network sector. And while there's some commonalities across the work done by care and support workers in these sectors, there are some differences as well. I won't go into all of them in detail, but just to point out some obvious differences. Home and community and disability support tends to happen not in a 24/7 way, but we're sort of the out of bed and into bed sort of period of time. So residential aged care have got a different rostering kind of system, whereas the others may well be broken shifts because of, requirements of the clients. Traditionally across all 3, minimum wage or close to it, so low-waged work and typically women's work. If we think about the type of work they're doing, the workers who are out in the community and with disability sector, they're more likely to be required to be autonomous workers. They're at distance from their managers. There's very little oversight, probably. They have a much higher level of responsibility because they are the ones who are often the primary eyes on the clients. So in aged care, where you've got individuals with probably declining health and complex health issues, or in disability, where it's very important to be aware of changes in people's levels of health, the care worker may well be one of the few people that has a consistent connection and oversight with that person. So the level of responsibility is fairly high when you consider that it's a traditionally low-paid area. There's a lot of expectation. Qualifications in these sectors haven't been something which we have seen a high importance placed until this settlement, and Katherine will discuss that further. But we found that a lot of women who work in these sectors may have very long tenure, 20, 30 years, but not necessarily holding qualifications. And it is complex work, as I've kind of described already. The potential for errors are reasonably high. There's a lot expected of the people working in these jobs.
So as an very brief overview of the 2017 pay equity settlement, it arose out of a case taken initially in 2012 by Christine Bartlett under our Equal Pay Act 1972. And this was after years, possibly decades, of demands for increased wages that were not being met and not really being listened to. One of the key things about that legal claim was that the first judgment really interpreted the Equal Pay Act in a way that people hadn't previously, which meant that you could look at aged care and say, well, yes, men and women earn the same within this industry, largely, but they are paid a lot less compared to a male-dominated industry or sector with very similar skills and responsibilities. And so in the 40-odd years of that legislation, it had never been interpreted or used in that way. Perhaps because of that, it went through 2 appeals. And it was when it was taken to the Supreme Court, appealed by the employers' representatives, that the government stepped in. And instigated negotiations between the key parties to avoid further legal action. The settlement, when it was finalised in 2017, was worth approximately $2 billion, and it covers a 5-year period and approximately 55,000 workers. It didn't address just wages, it included the opportunity for training as a legal right of these workers. It is important to note that the legislation and the settlement does cover a period of 5 years. And it's not entirely clear what happens at the end of that 5-year period. And during that 5-year period, those 55,000 workers that are covered by the settlement can't take any further legal claim. Nevertheless, it potentially makes a big difference to the lives of a lot of mainly women workers in New Zealand. And what we're doing today is reporting not on how the legislation came about, but how it's been implemented across these 3 sectors. And then I think it's over to Julie.
Yes. So as Katherine said, wages was a significant part of the settlement, but not the only part. But I thought it might be useful for you to sort of get a feel for the sort of impact that the settlement had on workers. So in 2017, the minimum wage in New Zealand was $15.75. And as we've already pointed out, many of the workers in these sectors were on or around the minimum wage. So Christine Bartlett, who had just retired or was about to retire, who took this case, when the case was taken, she'd been working, 30 years, 40 years in the sector? And at the time of the case going forward, she was on 50 cents more than the minimum wage. And we often think that we start at the minimum wage and then there's a trajectory, but that's not necessarily the case. So $15.75. So when the settlement came in, those who didn't have any qualifications and hadn't been working in the sector very long immediately jumped to $19 an hour. And those who were deemed to be at level 4 jumped to $23.50. So you can see it's a significant jump. And across the 5 years, they have put in place the scales that the 5 years relate to. There is no allowance for an increase next year unless the labour cost index goes up by a certain amount, and they will review that. So if we look at July 2019, well, at the moment, your minimum wage is $19.49, which translates to about $20.30 New Zealand. So you can kind of, see the gap between the 2 countries, but also where this scale lies in relation to the minimum wage. While there's a big gap here, the gap narrows across the 5 years, and I'm not sure if the workers themselves are aware that by the end of the settlement, they're not going to be quite so well off as they were at the beginning. But as Katherine said, we don't know what's going to happen after the 5 years, whether it's going to be down to governments moving the salaries or whether it's about collective bargaining. Certainly we wouldn't expect to see the wages go the other way, but this was what was in the settlement, and this is what brought about a lot of happiness. It was a significant increase when it came in.
Okay. So how we did this research was in partnership with the New Zealand Human Rights Commission and industry partners through a group called the Caring Counts Coalition, which includes a wide range of stakeholders across all of the care sectors, including unions, employers' associations, and bodies that represent the clients and older people themselves as well. So it really started from discussion around that table about how the implementation of the Act was going in the end of 2017 and what they really wanted to find out. And they really wanted to find out as a group what was happening at the coalface and in practice day to day, not what the law was about, but actually how managers were implementing it and what it meant for workers across a broad range of factors. So we used qualitative research because Ministries of Health is collecting some of the data on numbers and qualifications of workers every year as part of the settlement and part of the funding. But in order to get that in-depth picture and knowledge about what is happening, we talked to managers and care workers across the nation, both North and South Islands, and there are some really big differences in the North and South Island and between regional and city bases in New Zealand. For example, Auckland is one of the most diverse in terms of number of ethnicities cities in the world, and in New Zealand, and it has a bigger population base, whereas a large number of workers also work in smaller towns with rural areas, which affects things like travel time and how they get to and from work and other elements like that. We spoke to a total of 69 participants across all three sectors in small focus groups and some interviews, mostly face-to-face, to get the results that we do have and the findings.
So it was really hard to get 69 people. It was extraordinary. We thought that a workforce that doesn't often have the opportunity to have their voice heard would be clamouring to be heard, and we found it really difficult to get participants. And yet we found when a focus group would run, they would say, oh, I wish so-and-so would come. And the people who did participate in the focus groups seemed to really benefit from having an opportunity to talk about what had been happening to them. So maybe, if we do some more work in the area, word will be out that this is a good thing to be involved in. But we were a bit frustrated with the 69. I think Katherine always prefers to get to a round number, so, we have to work harder. But what we did find, and these are just some cherry-picked findings, so, you'd have to read the report to get a bigger picture of it. But not surprisingly, both managers and workers thought that the increase in wages was great. So the managers were all very positive. They said it was fantastic that workers were getting their work acknowledged and there was some recognition. And I'm sure they were really pleased about that because they themselves weren't paying it. So they were very happy to see the money coming from the government that they could pass on to their workers. It's an interesting point that the workers, of course, thought it was great, but some of them were a little bit reticent and they said, well, actually, there were some downsides to it, which we're going to get into. But generally, of course, everybody thought it was great. There was a cost, and this is where we start finding some of the outcomes which are problematic with the settlement. Managers, particularly in smaller providers, found it very difficult to meet the requirements of the settlement. They said they didn't have the capacity to do so. Some had to bring in other workers with different skills. Some of them had to change their computer systems because it was very complex. You had workers who were getting paid from different providers of contracts, so pay slips were very difficult to generate. There was a lot of confusion. They didn't feel well supported. And that was problematic more so in smaller providers who had less capacity. In some of the very big providers, there was already in place a very substantial HR function who could cope with the changes and understand what was required. For the workers, in the different sectors, there were some different things happening. So, as that quote there says, it makes business sense. If they say get $37 an hour for a client and they pay me $24 and somebody else only $19.50, it makes sense to send the cheaper person. So this was somebody from the home and community sector, and it caused a lot of problems where some people who were deemed to be on level 4, i.e. $23.50, suddenly had their hours cut because the employer, had a bottom line on their budget and wages was a big component. And why would you send a level 4 person to a client who needs level 1 care? And so there was pressure on employers to use their rostering processes to make ends meet. So that was a serious problem. So some people argued that actually after the settlement they were worse off financially, which wasn't the purpose of the point. In residential aged care, what we found was that some of the people involved in the focus groups said that there was an expectation of increased complexity of their work or increased workload. So we found some care workers were being expected to take over some of the roles of nursing jobs and tasks. That the employer was saying, well, I'm paying you more, you can do more. So they found that their job became bigger and bigger. There were some people who found themselves now on level 4, and with that an expectation they would take more leadership in the role, and they didn't feel able to and were feeling squeezed out of even the job completely. So there was some unintended consequences that came about. And the higher cost was was felt by both managers in the institutions, but also workers themselves having to bear the brunt of this, fantastic settlement, which wasn't what was meant to happen. And this sort of flowed on to this idea about the perceptions of the job. So at the beginning, as I said, all the managers said it was great that the workers had more money. There was no argument around that. But one manager said, they were quite forthright, it was quite interesting. And one manager said, it didn't change the quality, it just changed their own concept of their self-worth. But not the actual quality or change of that provision that they were providing. So again, this is kind of indicative of the fact that managers didn't understand what the settlement was about. It wasn't about job resizing, it wasn't about understanding or reflecting greater complexity, it was about addressing historic gender disadvantage. So the job itself hadn't changed, it was a recognition of the job. And many managers didn't get that, and they were quite angry about that, weren't they? That came through a few times, that they sort of felt this was just wrong, that these workers should work harder and longer and more complex and have more responsibility because I'm paying you more, I expect more. So there was this coming through, and then the workers in response were feeling that tension, and like this person argues that they just felt like the managers thought they were a bunch of peasants. They said it was like working in a shop, it was disgusting. So while their work was recognised through increased money, their value was not recognised, their care wasn't recognised, their work wasn't recognised, and they as individuals in that certainly wasn't getting the recognition that they felt was the purpose of the settlement. So it left a lot of tension in many workplaces rather than resolving them.
So building on those findings and some others that we don't touch on in as much detail today, these were some of our policy recommendations. And they were aimed at, I guess, the diversity of the stakeholders that informed and consulted on the research, and also aimed at a variety of levels. So some of these could be taken up by government agencies if they were willing, and or other industry stakeholders like the employer representatives or the unions, or both working together, or could actually be implemented and actioned at an organisational level. The first recommendation really does need to be a industry-wide or sector-wide and national kind of discussion around creating a culture of value. And that's really the education program that perhaps if the settlement hadn't been implemented in a hurry before a general election, there may have been a bit more education around why it had occurred and what it was about. And so had more of that happened, perhaps the managers would have been a bit more on board with the actual intent of the higher wages. The employer representatives have wanted higher wages for their employees for a while, but have been really reticent, and in fact, in the mid-2000s prevented the funding model changing to tie increased funding to increased wages. But they've wanted it not to address gender discrimination, but for recruitment and retention purposes. So more discussion around the culture of value of work has to happen. And I think we're seeing some of the other consequences outside of the settlement, like the union's current campaign around in safer hands around staffing ratios, for example, is still showing that this is very much a marketised view of care and care work, where perhaps the quality of care and good work conditions are not central to how it's organised. As we mentioned in the overview to the settlement, training and qualifications were really key and are a really important thing. Some of the workers we've spoken to informally recently have actually really grown and built their confidence through the opportunity now to do formal qualifications. For some of them, it is their first opportunity to study. It opens up more opportunities than what they're currently doing. And it does provide a career path, which hopefully then feeds into that idea that this is a valuable, worthy job. There's some, at the moment, where the government's reviewing all of our vocational qualifications in New Zealand, so it will be interesting to see where those qualifications and models lead to. But what does need to happen is that the gender equal pay that is addressed in the schedule of hourly wages is maintained, that in the kind of quasi-professionalisation of the work, we are not doing what managers currently are and saying it is only worth more if you do higher qualifications. If that's how it becomes seen, then we're not actually addressing the gender discrimination of the work historically. Thank you. One of the other consequences of formal qualifications and those being tied to progress through a wage schedule was that there are a group of workers who are being edged out of this work. And those are workers who have literacy issues, maybe around language and English not being their first language, or may need other learning support. And so in developing the sectors overall and developing our workforce, policy and the industry stakeholders really need to address how those workers are going to be supported to move with how the settlement is shaping all of those industries. One of the other things that we pointed to as well was actually development for managers. So Julie mentioned that some managers have really struggled with the regulatory requirements because the reporting and requirements, particularly in home care, are quite complex, or more complex than they were before. But it also requires a type of management and a development approach that hasn't really been used in that marketised model of care. Managers have kind of employed workers and not put a lot of effort into developing them, and not all of them, into developing them because it has been low-wage, low-value work. And that again links to role expectations. So keeping a close eye and monitoring, perhaps more than the labour cost index as well, how society views those jobs and that work. And some conversations that have been happening actually at the Caring Counts Coalition have been focusing on the client as well, because if we're not valuing those jobs, that work and those skills, then we're not actually not valuing the client. So it's not just the workers who may be disadvantaged if we don't keep our eye on the prize, which was the gender equal valuing of the work. And again, linking back to qualifications, keeping, there's a bit of a tension between increasing formal qualification expectations and maintaining that the job itself was undervalued because of gender discrimination. While it is difficult to get a clear handle on funding, the Ministry of Health will say that it's adequately funded, but actually the legislation doesn't require full funding, just the direct costs. Providers large and small mostly will say it's underfunded. We think overall actually that it probably is inadequate funding. It was short and tight funding before the settlement, and not all costs associated with it appear to have been covered. But some of the negative consequences for workers, the reduction of hours, the increase of workload and increase of responsibilities, does link to the funding model itself. So the funding, whether it's in residential aged care, disability support or home care, is linked to the assessment of the client. So you have a funding model linked to the client, but a wage schedule linked to the training and qualifications of a worker, and the funding won't necessarily then cover a level 4 worker providing care for a level 1 client. And that is going to lead to difficulties at the very least, or challenges for managers and for implementing it. There has been a funding and service review just released last month, but I'm not too sure that it would address some of those issues around the responsiveness of the funding model. I think Julie mentioned how both managers and employees in focus groups talked to us about how pleased they were that someone actually took the time to listen. And that was both managers and employees. This settlement was settled at a high level. It was the top union representatives, top government representatives, and top employer representatives. The employers weren't a formal party to the settlement, but they were part of the negotiation process. And so there was a lot of confusion from both employees and employers about what exactly management was required or obligated to do and what exactly were the rights of employees. And actually, a lot of the work was being done by unions. Some managers of the smaller companies had not had a lot of success in getting clear information from government agencies and would actually refer their workers through to the unions because they were the bodies that actually knew what should be happening. So this was 1 year ago, a year after the settlement had been implemented. So hopefully some of that communication has been happening in the year intervening, but it was very clear that as part of the development from the negotiations being settled into legislation covering it, that actually more clear and easy to use guidelines and, I guess, facts, frequently asked questions, should have been developed from government agencies. It was too hard for the people at the coalface to access that and use the information.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So, in conclusion, as I said, we've kind of cherry-picked stuff, so please, your questions are going to be welcome. But some of the things that really stood out, funding didn't cover the costs that providers experienced, and there was hardship involved in that. And the problem with this inadequate funding is that it encouraged a continued downward pressure on workers in order to minimise those costs. So the deliberate employing of people with no qualifications, because then they could get them very cheaply. There was some evidence that opportunities for training were kind of skirted around, or only people who were shoulder tapped got opportunities to move up through the qualifications. And we saw some workers actually losing hours because they were overqualified for the jobs that were required. So the downward pressure on workers is a really big problem when the settlement was about workers having a fairer part of the deal. As I've pointed out, the manager's attitude to care work had not changed after the settlement, and the culture of care, which Katherine's described, may well help to change that. And management practice resulted in negative work experiences for many care workers. And, New Zealand does have a shortage of workers in these sectors. It is a problem which is going to balloon out of control potentially in future years if the projections are right. So the idea that we're creating a workplace with these negative work experiences, making the work less desirable, is going to have an ongoing compounding problem. So we would like to welcome any questions about our work, and thank you very much for listening.